I'll pick up where I left off with my hypotheses. So the second half of that, as I began discussing in my other recording, was that I anticipate that teachers in the EU will earn higher scores on their lessons than foreign language teachers in the US. And that's due to the nature of a higher emphasis being placed on multilingualism in the EU than in the EU and then in the US. For example, when I was reading articles about foreign language programs in the EU, as I was kind of deciding how I was going to go about this research study, I found that, as I was saying earlier, all 27 national languages that are represented in the EU are used in formal documentation. And furthermore, depending on the country in which a person resides, it's compulsory that schools offer and that students take at least one, if not two, foreign language classes, all of which are national languages of the EU. So when I had met these individuals who speak 3, 4, 5, 6 languages, it's because it's incredibly emphasized. And then I was reading another study that it incorporates just so many other factors, such as migration patterns and where people migrate based on the languages that they know. And so unemployment rates are significantly lower because the number of jobs are that much higher within the EU of knowing multiple languages and being found useful and needed in these different facets of the professional field. So this kind of helped shape my second piece of the hypothesis of that teachers would be seen as more effective teachers is essentially what these higher scores mean. And basically the scoring system was just based on 4 particular observations, including the time that teachers would be using. So how many minutes the teacher is observed using the foreign language, which is huge because, as I was saying in the last recording, as part of my internship, I was observing the Spanish teacher at our school. And I didn't keep track of the exact times. But what led me to shape this particular piece of the observation was that this teacher, the Spanish teacher, the students were English speaking students who were learning Spanish. And the amount of time that the teacher actually spoke in Spanish was, if I had to guess, less than 5 minutes of the 50-minute class. And then considering the fact that it's a special or a unified arts course, and so it's every other day for an hour instead of every day like the other core curriculum classes are, that's 5 minutes every other day that the students are hearing Spanish. And it, in turn, the way that the students treated Senor Leyva was dramatically different from the way that they treated me as a teacher whom they saw every day. It goes without saying, I use English for my whole class because it's English language arts. And so I have an advantage that this is the student's native language, but I think there's something to be said about the amount of time that you're using the content that you're studying and that the students are studying. And I just wanted to see if there was a relationship between the amount of time that the teachers were using the language, the amount of time the students were expected to use the language, the types of methods that the teachers used, whether technology was incorporated in the class, and if so, how, things of that nature. And so the other piece of my hypothesis was that foreign language teachers in the EU are probably trained more strongly than those in the United States to have a better understanding of how to motivate students to learn the target languages, because the students will be using these languages immediately outside of the classroom because of the linguistic diversity present in the EU that's just not present in the United States, at least in the rural region in New England from which I come. So I think there's something to be said about that. The materials used in this study were the student survey, and that was gathering data about students' age, the number of years they'd been studying the foreign language, as well as these intangible and difficult facets to measure pieces such as the attitude towards the class, the perception of the meaningfulness of learning a foreign language, their perception of how many minutes the teacher used the foreign language, their perception of whether it's a geographic location that encourages them to use this foreign language outside of the classroom, things of that nature. And again, that gets at my second research question of, are there other factors? I was trying to get the kids to think, are there pieces that are effective or ineffective maybe even outside of the classroom, that contribute to their linguistic success or lack thereof. The second material used was the teacher's observation checklist, and this is how I gathered data about the amount of time the teacher spent using the target language, the amount of time students were expected to, instructional methods employed, and then also the level of processing activities, whether it was active or passive participation, if students were actively having to speak and use the language, what types of projects or assignments they were expected to do, whether it was a worksheet versus like project-based learning, things of that nature. And then as well, the informed consent document for students, teachers, and so the students that also had the minor assent form and the IRB application, things of that nature, the procedure for both the students and the teachers. But so those were all the materials. The procedure was obviously selecting participants first, and I focused just in New Hampshire and Amsterdam because that's where my connections were on my trip that I had mentioned earlier. I befriended a teacher who's an ESL teacher in Holland and in Amsterdam. And so we received permission from his administrator and from the students and their parents to have them participate in the study, as well as those in New Hampshire at the school in which I work, simply because it just helped narrow down and give a starting point for this study. Now, the date was chosen to have the teacher and the students observed. So that was an important piece of this, is the actual observation and the date to have the students fill out the survey. The teacher was observed by 3 outside observers and audio recorded to ensure that the data was accurate and to eliminate as much bias as possible. And then in the last 5 minutes of class, students were surveyed to gather their attitudes, motivation, anxiety, and their perception of the meaningfulness of learning a foreign language. The results showed that students in the EU were more motivated and found more enjoyment in foreign language studies than those of the US. I was not particularly surprised by that result. And then furthermore, the teachers in the EU used the target language more and had expectations of the students to use the target language more than those in the US. The analyses that correspond to the results, the implications of these results are that the more a student has an opportunity to use the target language, the more he or she will find value in learning it. And this stems from not only the teacher expecting the student to use the language so heavily, but also from the fact that students in the EU were able to use the target language outside of the classroom as well. Furthermore, motivation and attitude appear to be linked to the likelihood of obtaining a job by investing in that skill, and having opportunities to use the target language outside of the classroom certainly help, as I mentioned earlier. Limitations: only working with 2 schools, one in New Hampshire and the other in Amsterdam, limited the results astronomically. A greater range of data should be collected from the US and the EU to represent a more holistic set of data. It's quite challenging to study a person's attitude and isolate a factor such as these. So like what motivates a person, the anxiety a person feels, it's really hard to quantify that. So the Likert scale in the survey was set up to give some type of numerical data to support this. However, only conjectures can be made, but determining true attitude and motivation is nearly impossible while keeping the authenticity and integrity of the experiment. So it's just a factor that I had to navigate through. The conclusion is that the results determined that the EU teacher used the target language more in class and that students had higher motivation. They just had more buy-in overall than the students in the US. The implications is that there's a direct correlation between the amount of time the student uses the foreign language and the perceived meaningfulness to the student's immediate and future needs. And further future studies, I'd like to continue this research and get a broader perspective of foreign language programs across the United States and the EU. Only looking at one school in New Hampshire and one school in Holland does not do justice to the study, but it's a good starting point to understand the strengths and weaknesses in foreign language programs and the attitudes towards them in both places. There could also be future work to isolate other factors and study those factors rather than the broad, open-ended second research question that I had. But again, it just gave a good foundation for this study. And lastly, there's also room in analyzing intangible factors such as attitude, motivation, and enjoyment and anxiety more clearly and quantifiably rather than just the broad open-ended approach. So thanks for listening.